The date was March 22nd, 1996. The United Center in Chicago had been open for less than 2 years, and it still carried that particular smell of new concrete and ambition, the kind of arena built not merely to house a team, but to enshrine one. It was a Thursday night, 22 minutes past 7 in the Central Time Zone, and the temperature outside on West Madison Street had dropped to 11 degrees Fahrenheit. A cold so absolute it felt punitive, the kind that settles into the bones of anyone who has spent a winter in the city and knows it is not done with them yet. Inside, the building held 20,317 people, and the heat of that crowd had already raised the court-level temperature to 68 degrees, a warmth that was entirely human in origin, entirely earned. The parquet floor, that famous Bulls parquet with its dark finish and its perfect sight lines, gleamed under the overhead lighting with a quality that was almost liturgical. The stanchions were freshly padded. The baskets had been rehung that afternoon. Everything was in order. Everything was ready. The Chicago Bulls were in the middle of what would become the greatest regular season in the history of professional basketball. They would finish 72-10. The number would acquire the character of scripture in the years that followed, repeated in arguments and on television and in barbershops until it lost none of its power. Because numbers that represent genuine extremity never do. They were already 54-9 on this Thursday in March, and the team that had come to the United Center that evening was the Orlando Magic, which meant that this was not a neutral contest of basketball ambitions. This was a reckoning with recent history, and recent history was a wound on the city of Chicago that had not yet been permitted to heal. The Magic had eliminated the Bulls from the playoffs the previous spring in the second round of the 1995 Eastern Conference playoffs, and they had done it with the confidence of a team that believed it had not merely defeated Jordan's Bulls, but had replaced them, had stepped into the throne room and found it unoccupied. Shaquille O'Neal had been 23 years old and already the most physically dominant force the sport had ever produced, a fact that was not hyperbole but simple measurement. He was listed at 7 feet 1 inch and 315 pounds, though anyone who stood near him understood that those numbers were a courtesy, a compression of something larger into the language of statistics. He moved with a combination of mass and velocity that should have been contradictory and wasn't, and when he arrived at the basket there was, for opposing defenders, a moment of genuine physiological decision-making that had nothing to do with basketball strategy and everything to do with self-preservation. Coaches called it a matchup problem. Players called it something else, in terms they did not use in front of cameras. O'Neal had entered the 1995-96 season having averaged 29 and 3 points and 13 and 9 rebounds per game the season prior, numbers that would define a Hall of Fame career for any other man in any other era. He was the center of gravity around which the Magic organized everything, and he knew it with the uncomplicated confidence of the physically gifted who have never been required to develop a second argument for their greatness. He played with joy, with showmanship, with a performer's awareness of the room that made him both enormously likable and, in competitive terms, occasionally unfocused. He had spent the summer before the 1995-96 season making a feature film. He had signed endorsement deals that required scheduling around practice. He had released a rap album. None of this was offered as criticism precisely. It was offered as context, as the portrait of a man who understood himself as larger than any single arena, any single sport, any single night. In the days before the March 22nd game, reporters covering the Magic had asked O'Neal about the Bulls, about Jordan, about whether the Orlando team that had knocked Chicago out of the playoffs 9 months earlier was prepared for what they would find in the United Center. O'Neal had smiled, the way he always smiled, with the ease of a man who sees no reason to perform concern. He said that Jordan was a great player, but that Jordan did not have anyone to play with. He said that the era of Jordan's dominance was historical, that it belonged to the past, and that the present and the future wore a different jersey. He did not say this with malice particularly. He said it the way a person states what they regard as simple arithmetic, and the reporters wrote it down, and by game night it had been repeated on radio broadcasts across the Midwest and had appeared in 2 Chicago newspapers under headlines that were designed to be inflammatory and succeeded. Penny Hardaway had been more careful in his public statements, which was consistent with his character. Hardaway was 24 years old and already possessed of a point guard's intelligence that made him something rarer than a great scorer. He was a player who understood situations, who read the room, who knew when silence was more strategic than speech. He had averaged 21 points and 7 assists the previous season and was regarded by most analysts as the second-best player in the Eastern Conference, a ranking that implied a particular relationship to the first-best player in the Eastern Conference, and Hardaway understood the implication perfectly. He was, by reputation and by temperament, a competitor who preferred to make his arguments with his play rather than his mouth. But he had, in the locker room before the game, in a conversation that was partially overheard and partially reconstructed by 2 beat reporters who shared the information 6 hours later, made the remark that would become the inciting document of the evening. He had said, or had been reported to have said, in a tone that was either dismissive or simply honest depending on one's sympathies, that Jordan's reputation had grown beyond his actual current performance, that what the league was watching was a mythology engine operating on prior credit, and that on a given night, against a team with size and youth and athleticism, Jordan was manageable. The word manageable was the one that mattered. It was a technical word, a scouting word, the kind of word you use when you are trying to convince yourself that what frightens you is containable. The fact that Hardaway used it suggested he was, to some degree, trying to convince himself. Michael Jordan heard the word. He always heard. His relationship to disrespect was not passive, it was metabolic. He had spent his career constructing an internal economy in which slights were currency, and currency was fuel. And by the spring of 1996, he had become so efficient at this conversion that observers who knew him well sometimes wondered whether he was capable of genuine peace, whether the competitive furnace required constant feeding, whether there would ever be a morning when he woke without the need to prove something to someone. The answer, for those who knew him best, was no. But that answer was not a tragedy. It was a methodology. He arrived at the United Center that Thursday in the manner he always arrived, which was to say, without ceremony, without performance, without any visible acknowledgement that 20,000 people were about to watch him. He walked through the tunnel with the particular quality of stillness that his teammates had learned to read as danger. Not the loose, smiling Jordan of warm-ups, bouncing off the ball boys and chirping at the assistant coaches. Not the fierce, jaw-tight Jordan of the closing minutes. This was the third Jordan, the quiet one. The one that arrived when the competitive situation had been assessed and found to require something beyond ordinary application. Scottie Pippen noticed it from across the locker room and said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say. Dennis Rodman, who had joined the team that season and was still learning the interior weather of this particular franchise, watched Jordan tape his wrists in silence and understood without being told that the taping was not preparation but ritual, not athletic but psychological. Each pass of the white tape, a small act of focus that had nothing to do with his wrists and everything to do with the room he was about to enter. Jordan sat in front of his locker for 4 minutes without speaking to anyone. His eyes were open. He was looking at his locker, at the hanging jersey with the number 23 and the word Chicago and the red and black that had become, by 1996, the most recognizable uniform in professional sports. He was not looking at the jersey. He was looking at something interior, something that had no physical location, some arrangement of memory and intention that he was ordering, filing and locking into place. One of the ball boys who was permitted to stand at the edge of the locker room during pre-game preparation later said that Jordan in those 4 minutes was the quietest thing he had ever seen in a loud building, that the silence around him was not an absence of sound, but a presence of something else, a pressure, a density. The ball boy was 17 years old and did not yet have the language for what he was describing. What he was describing was the controlled fire of a man who had decided that tonight was not a basketball game. It was a demonstration. The magic began with intention. Their coaching staff had prepared a scheme built around physicality and pace, on getting O'Neal catches in the post in the first 4 minutes of every quarter, on using his gravitational pull on the defense to create open looks for Hardaway and the shooters operating around them. It was a coherent strategy, the kind of strategy that had worked in the playoffs the previous spring, and there was no particular reason to believe it would not work again. Orlando was a good basketball team. They were, By the standards of any season other than the one they were playing in, a very good basketball team, young and well-constructed and coached by Brian Hill with the quiet competence of a man who understood that his job was to create conditions for extraordinary players to be extraordinary. The strategy made sense. The strategy was sound. Jordan let it work, initially, in the way a storm system allows calm before it reorganizes. He scored 6 points in the first quarter on 2 mid-range jumpers and a free throw, numbers so ordinary they barely registered in the statistical consciousness of the crowd. He moved the ball on time. He took the shots the defense gave him. He did not force. He watched. Across the court, Horace Grant, who had left Chicago 2 years earlier, who had won 3 championships with Jordan and then departed for Orlando in free agency, was playing with a physical confidence that the crowd resented and acknowledged simultaneously, because Grant was a good player and the crowd was honest about basketball, even when honesty was uncomfortable. O'Neal in the post was, as always, a problem without a clean solution. Luke Longley and Will Perdue could obstruct him, could crowd him, could attempt to alter his angle and his timing, but they could not stop him, and everyone in the building understood this as a given condition of the evening, rather than a crisis to be managed. By the end of the first quarter, Orlando led 21-18, and the 3-point deficit was not the story. The story was the quality of the deficit, the fact that it had been built through execution rather than surprise, through design rather than accident, and that the Magic looked like a team that had come to the United Center not to survive but to establish something. In the hallway behind the Orlando bench during the first timeout of the second quarter, Hardaway said something to a teammate that was inaudible at broadcast distance but was accompanied by a gesture toward Jordan's position on the court, a gesture that carried the unmistakable posture of a man pointing at something he believes he has already accounted for. Jordan saw the gesture. His expression did not change. It was already the expression that had closed over his face in the locker room, the one his teammates feared, the one that meant the calculation was complete and the answer had been reached, and what remained was only the work of proving it. He played the second quarter in a register that was different from the first, different in quality rather than quantity, with a precision in his movement that was almost botanical in its deliberateness, growing toward the light that his defender offered, and then withdrawing before the reach could be completed, creating and eliminating space in sequences that were too fast for real-time comprehension and required the reduced frame rate of replay to fully see. He finished the half with 14 points, and the number was not extraordinary by any standard measure, but the way the 14 had been accumulated, its architecture, its intentionality, the sense that each possession had been assessed from its opening frame and resolved at the precise moment of maximum efficiency, had created in the Orlando bench a quality of discomfort that was not yet visible in the score, but was fully present in the body language of the men watching. At halftime, the Bulls led 37-34. In the Orlando locker room, Hardaway addressed his teammates in the direct, clear-headed manner that was his standard mode of leadership. He said they were up to the challenge. He said the scheme was working. He said that Jordan was Jordan, that you had to expect him to have his moments, but that containing him to 14 points in a half was within the range of acceptable, that the plan was sound and the execution needed only refinement. He said these things with conviction because he believed them. He had to believe them. The alternative, that what he had watched for the previous 24 minutes was not Jordan performing at his level, but Jordan performing below his level, Jordan in the early stages of an assessment, Jordan patiently building the case for something that had not yet arrived, was not a thought he was prepared to accommodate. The third quarter opened with a Jordan triple, a catch-and-fire three-pointer from the left wing off a Pippen drive and kick that entered the basket so cleanly, with such an absence of rim contact, that the sound was not the usual metallic clatter, but a soft, organic fall. The sound of a ball finding the exact center of a circle, which is the purest sound in basketball and the rarest. The crowd responded not with a roar, but with a collective intake of breath, the particular sound of 20,000 people recognizing that something has shifted, but not yet being certain what. Jordan did not gesture. He did not speak. He turned and jogged back on defense with his lips slightly parted and his eyes already scanning the court for the next possession, already thinking 3 plays ahead of the one that had just concluded. 2 possessions later, Nick Anderson isolated on Jordan in the half court. which was the kind of decision that required a specific variety of confidence. The confidence of a man who has done something before and believes it will hold. Anderson had famously, in the 1995 playoffs, stolen the ball from Jordan in the final seconds of a close game, a moment that had entered the collective memory of basketball, not because it was typical, but precisely because it wasn't. Because it represented the rare contingency that the sport occasionally produces, when the improbable intersects with the desperate. Anderson had spoken publicly about that moment in the months since. He had done so with understandable pride, because it had been a remarkable play, a moment of genuine athletic achievement. The speaking, however, had reached Jordan. Everything reached Jordan. Anderson made his move to the left, a crossover that was quick and correctly timed, the kind of move that succeeded against most NBA defenders in most NBA possessions. Jordan did not bite. He slid left with a lateral quickness that was physiologically implausible for a 6'6" man of his musculature. And then, in the moment of Anderson's recovery, Jordan reached and stripped the ball with his right hand in a single motion that was so complete and so final that there was a half-second of genuine disorientation in Anderson's body, a brief interval in which his hands continued to move in the pattern of a dribble that was no longer there. Jordan was already gone. He pushed the ball ahead, crossed half-court in 3 strides, and finished with a left-handed layup against Hardaway, who had rotated back, a layup that was not the obvious choice. The obvious choice was the right hand. The right hand was the dominant hand. The right hand was what defenders prepared for. And the choice of the left hand was therefore not athleticism, but communication. The statement of a man who is telling you that he can hurt you in ways you haven't planned for, which is a different thing from simply being better than you. The United Center then produced a sound that was not a cheer and not a roar, but something between, a sustained tone of collective release. 20,000 people exhaling at once, the sound of a crowd that has been waiting for something and has finally received it, and is now in the process of understanding what it has received. Jordan pointed once at the scorer's table, a small gesture, almost administrative in its brevity, and then he was in his defensive stance, feet shoulder-width apart, hands low, eyes up. The fourth quarter arrived with Chicago leading by 9, 58-49. And the lead was not yet decisive in the way of basketball leads, not yet the kind of margin that closes the narrative, because 9 points in professional basketball with 12 minutes remaining is a situation that has been overcome thousands of times and can be overcome again. The Magic organize themselves with the focused efficiency of a team that has been in these situations before, that has the athletic talent and the coaching intelligence to manufacture a run. And their first 4 possessions of the quarter produced 7 points and reduced the lead to 2. And the United Center experienced, for the first time that evening, the specific tension of a crowd that believes in its team, but is not yet certain. The anxiety of the faithful, who see the miracle potentially being taken back. Jordan called a timeout. He didn't do this officially. The Bulls called the timeout, and Jordan simply stood in the center of it, with the particular quality of stillness that had characterized the locker room 3 hours earlier. And he looked at his teammates with a directness that required no translation. Phil Jackson said something. Jordan let it land, and then he said, quietly enough that the cameras near the huddle did not capture it clearly, something about the quality of the next 5 minutes, about what was owed, about what was stored. One of his teammates later described Jordan's voice in that timeout as the quietest, loud thing he had ever heard, which is not a paradox, but a precise account of the specific acoustic character of absolute authority. He came out of the timeout and he was different, or rather he was more completely himself, more fully operational. The previous 3 quarters having been, it now became clear, the process of reading the examination before beginning to write the answers. He isolated Hardaway on the right wing, pump-faked once, a pump fake of extraordinary economy, barely a movement of the shoulders and the ball, enough. And when Hardaway left his feet, Jordan gathered and drove into the lane and rose and finished over O'Neal's outstretched hand with a floating right-hand finger roll that defied the geometry of the situation, that should not have passed over O'Neal's 7 feet 1 inch of vertical reach, but did. That found an angle that seemed available only to Jordan's particular combination of elevation and body control and the deeply specific knowledge of what could be done in the air that only came from 33 years of understanding exactly what his body was capable of. The ball dropped through. The crowd's response was physical. People stood. People who had been seated for 3 quarters stood at that exact moment and did not sit again. O'Neal landed from his jump attempt and stood at the free throw line with his hands at his sides and his head slightly forward and his eyes on the basket, which had already released the ball and was now simply a basket again, inert and indifferent. He stood there for 1.5 seconds, which is a long time to stand still in an NBA game, and in those 1.5 seconds, the structure of the evening arranged itself around him in a way that was, for O'Neal, disorienting in a manner that had nothing to do with basketball. He was 23 years old, and he had done things on a basketball court that had made the most experienced coaches in the sport describe his talent with the kind of language they normally reserved for geological events. He had been told since high school that he was inevitable, that his physical gifts placed him outside the normal order of basketball ambition, that the question was not whether he would dominate, but only how thoroughly. He had believed this, not arrogantly, but empirically, because the evidence consistently supported it. He stood now at the free throw line looking at a basket and understanding, at a depth that was new to him, that inevitability was not protection against this, that there was something in the building that was older than physicality, something that operated according to a different system entirely, something that had been constructed not from gifts but from decisions, from the patient and deliberate conversion of every slight and every doubt and every loss into the specific kind of competitive energy that did not exhaust itself but compounded. He would not have used those words. He was 23. The language for it comes later, if it comes at all. But the understanding was there, wordless and complete. In the 1.5 seconds he stood at the free throw line on the night of March 22nd, 1996. Then he turned and walked back to the huddle, and his face was the face of a man who has just been shown something he did not know existed, and is working on deciding what to do with that information. Jordan scored 11 of the Bulls' next 15 points. The final score was 86-67. The 19-point margin was not the truth of the game. The truth was the quality of the margin, the fact that it had been administered rather than accumulated, that each point in the final 8 minutes had been placed with the precision of a craftsman who is not hurrying, because hurrying is for people who are not certain of the outcome. Jordan finished with 36 points, 7 assists, and 5 steals, and the statistics were accurate and also beside the point, because what the game contained was not reducible to statistics. The stake in the steals were the visible record of an interior performance, the surface of something that went much deeper and had started much earlier, in the locker room 4 minutes before warm-ups, or in the summer of 1993 when Jordan retired for the first time and people said he was done, or in the spring of 1995 when the Magic eliminated the Bulls and Hardaway used the word manageable. In the Orlando locker room after the game, Hardaway sat in front of his locker for a long time without moving. He had played 28 points and 7 assists, which was, by any external measure, a strong performance. The performance of a player who is genuinely excellent. The box score would be generous to him in the morning papers, but Hardaway was too intelligent to read a box score as the text of an evening, and what he was sitting with in the locker room was not the column of numbers, but the texture of the game as it had actually unfolded, the quality of Jordan's attention to him specifically, the way Jordan had seemed to know where Hardaway was going before Hardaway had decided, the way the defensive adjustments had been made with a precision that felt personal, not strategic. The way the whole evening had the character of a prepared argument rather than an athletic contest. You could play excellently and still lose this argument. That was the thing. You could do your job completely and still be in the presence of something that exceeded the frame of the job entirely. Brian Hill walked through the locker room 15 minutes after the game ended and said the things coaches say, accurate things about effort and execution, and the opportunities available in the next game, the next week, the rest of the season. The words were received, but they did not penetrate very far because the men in that locker room were all, at some level, engaged in a private version of the same reckoning. They had come to Chicago believing, with legitimate evidence, that they were a great basketball team in the midst of a great season, and they were leaving having encountered something that operated beyond the category of greatness, something that required a different vocabulary, something that used their greatness as a backdrop rather than a contest. The humiliation was not the score. The humiliation was the recognition that the score was, in some sense, irrelevant, that it could have been different by 10 points in either direction, and the fundamental statement of the evening would have remained unchanged. O'Neill dressed quickly and left the building without speaking to reporters, which was unusual for him. He was, ordinarily, one of the most accessible and engaging players in the league with the media, a natural performer who understood that the press conference was its own kind of stage and had never been uncomfortable on it. His departure that night was not the action of a man who was angry or sulking. Those would have been comprehensible responses. It was the action of a man who needed to be alone with what he had just understood, who was not yet ready to put it into the context of sentences, who would need several days before he could reconstruct a narrative around the evening that permitted him to move forward. He sat in the bus and looked out the window at West Madison Street and its 11-degree cold and the people moving quickly with their heads down against the wind, and he thought about what it meant to be 23 years old and to have done everything you were supposed to do and to have encountered something that did not acknowledge the scorecard by which you had been measuring yourself. He would, in the years that followed, become one of the greatest players the sport had ever seen. The records he set, the championships he won, the physical dominance he maintained over a career of 2 decades would be the substance of a legacy that stood independent of any single night in March. He would speak later in his career about Jordan, about that season, about what it had meant to his own development to play against the Bulls in 1996, and the word he would use was educational, which is not the word of a man who was broken by the experience, but of a man who converted it, who took what the evening contained and used it as material. This is, perhaps, the greatest available tribute to what Jordan produced on the nights like March 22nd. Not that he destroyed his opponents, but that the best of them came back better, carrying his lesson forward into the rest of their careers, building themselves in response to what they had been shown. Jordan dressed in the home locker room with the same economy of motion that characterized everything he did when the competitive situation was resolved. He spoke to Pippen briefly about a play in the third quarter, a technical conversation about a defensive rotation, conducted in the tone of 2 professionals reviewing the mechanics of completed work. He signed an autograph for a child who had been permitted, through some backstage arrangement, to stand near the locker room exit. He put on his street clothes, a dark suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and that he wore with the specific casualness of a man for whom the suit is costume rather than aspiration. He left the building through the tunnel that athletes use, the tunnel that keeps them apart from the crowds that have come to see them, and when he emerged into the Chicago night, the cold hit him immediately, and he stopped for a moment. One moment, in the darkness between the tunnel exit and the waiting car, and his breath was visible in the cold air. A small cloud of exhaled heat rising and dispersing, and he looked up at the sky above the city, which was orange-gray with reflected light and completely absent of stars, and whatever he was thinking in that moment belonged entirely to him. He would be back in this building in 48 hours, against a different team, with a different set of accounts to settle, because there was always a different team and there was always an account that someone had opened without understanding the terms, and Jordan would show up to close it. This was not a burden he carried. It was the structure of his days, the organizing principle of his existence, the thing that made the morning worthwhile and the night after the game incomplete even when the game was won. He got in the car. The city moved past the windows. He was already thinking about the next game. What the evening in the United Center revealed, stripped of its spectacle and its mythology, was something older and simpler than basketball, something available to anyone willing to pay the price of its acquisition. Jordan had built himself not on the foundation of his gifts, but on the foundation of his losses, had developed the alchemical capacity to take the leaden weight of humiliation and doubt and convert it, not quickly, not painlessly, not through the forgetting of what had hurt him, but through the precise opposite, the obsessive retention of it. The decision to carry it as fuel rather than as wound, into performances that exceeded the upper boundary of what the human competitive spirit was supposed to be able to produce. The scar tissue was the architecture. The rejection was the blueprint. The doubt was the raw material. He had looked at everything the world told him he couldn't do, and he had used the telling as the method. Not despite the pressure. Because of it. Not in spite of the fire. Inside it. The 19-point margin was posted on scoreboards across the country and forgotten by most people within a week. What was not forgotten was the night itself, by the men who had been in it, who carried it into the rest of their careers as a kind of permanent calibration, a measurement of what excellence actually looks like when it is operating at full capacity, when it has been fed by years of accumulated anger and converted into something clean and devastating and ultimately, in the deepest sense of the word, beautiful. You do not have to play basketball to understand what Jordan proved in those final 8 minutes against Orlando, in the quiet of a timeout and the flight of a left-handed finger roll, and the 1.5 seconds a 23-year-old stood at the free throw line and began his education. The lesson is portable. The lesson is this: the thing that was meant to break you is the only thing that can make you unbreakable. And the distance between those two outcomes is nothing more and nothing less than a decision.